In this fifth video, we'll look at the American Revolution in its latter years, from 1778 to when the fighting ended in 1781. After 1778, the British replaced General Howe with General Henry Clinton. And Clinton decided that they should attack the American South, sort of changing their strategy, assuming it would be easier. Also, the South had rice, tobacco, and indigo, and more likely to have slaves rise up. I should add that the French had their troops down in the Caribbean, and that kind of thought the British thought they should probably move it down there, their troops southward, to be prudent. Anyway, the British recognized that the bulk of Washington's army remained up north in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York. As General Clinton moved troops from Philadelphia back to New York, he thought Philadelphia was too difficult to supply, New York was easier. He ordered General Charles Cornwallis to attack Charleston, South Carolina, in early 1780. Cornwallis only had 4,000 troops, but he had enough to have a long siege of Charleston, which wasn't as readily defended. There weren't as many defenders. You know, of all the British commanders, Cornwallis was probably the boldest and probably one of the better ones. As Cornwallis besieged Charleston, Washington responded by appointing Nathanael Greene to lead the American forces in the South. Greene had proved pretty adept at rallying the colonists. He was a good general. He was smart enough to adopt conciliatory policies towards the Southern Loyalists, thereby weakening resistance, and also made some alliances with the Western Indians. Anyway, throughout 1781, Greene and Cornwallis fought a series of battles. From the fall of Charleston and fall of 1780, throughout pretty much 1781, Greene and Cornwallis fought a series of battles in the thick woods of western Carolinas, North and South Carolina. It wasn't the orderly type of fighting that the British were used to. The Americans would hide behind trees and rocks, more guerrilla-style fighting, and it was particularly bloody as a result. One of Greene's commanders, Francis Marion, as a matter of fact, was particularly adept at this type of fighting, and he kind of became famous as a result. The British termed Marion the Swamp Fox, and he kind of remains a figure of lore, although he often clashed with Greene because Marion always wanted more horses. As Greene and Cornwallis fought these battles, 1780, 1781, General Clinton, as I've said earlier, moved his British troops back to New York, and most of Washington's army followed, and they'd encircled the city of New York. A key fortress in the American fortress as part of this encircling of New York was up the Hudson River at West Point. Benedict Arnold, who again was regarded as somewhat of a hero, begged Washington to be appointed as the commander at West Point. Arnold was 39 years old at the time, and he did have a big ego, and he felt like he never received his due for his victory. When Benedict Arnold was passed over for even a greater promotion, he devised a plan to help the British and to defect, and where he thought he'd get more respect. But the plan was to get a map of the West Point fortifications to Clinton in New York, and that would make the fortress vulnerable, and they'd know how to attack it. Clinton sent his personal envoy, the British Major John Andre, behind American lines to negotiate with Arnold. After Andre met General Arnold and got the plans, he was trying to make it back to the British in New York City, and he had stuffed the plans for West Point into his boot. But he was stopped by some sentries, and they discovered that he was a spy, and spies were hanged. He wasn't in his British uniform, And Arnold was, by all accounts, very brave, when he was hanged, and he was kind of revered. The Americans, meanwhile, saw Arnold as a traitor, and he became infamous even as Andre became somewhat famous. News of Arnold's betrayal spread fast throughout the colonies, and indeed he's remained infamous today. Washington obviously was angered and tried to arrest Arnold, but just missed him. Arnold made it through the British lines to New York City only minutes before Washington arrived. And Arnold's going to remain, like I say, vilified in history. In early 1781, after the Battle of Kings Mountain in the fall of 1780 in Carolina, Cornwallis was growing increasingly frustrated at the guerrilla-style, mobile-style of fighting that Greene was waging in the South. And Cornwallis decided to push the war further northward into more developed Virginia. Cornwallis captured Williamsburg and then moved westward on Charlottesville, which was home to Jefferson's Monticello, shown here. Jefferson got word from a writer only moments before the British arrived at his home, and Jefferson was able to flee. Several of Jefferson's slaves, by the way, fled to the British. Cornwallis and his troops then decided to settle in the port of Yorktown, waiting for supplies from the British Navy. Yorktown was located on a peninsula. When news reached Washington outside New York that a large fleet from France had sailed for America, he made a fateful decision. He'd move his forces secretly south from New York to corner Cornwallis on the peninsula. If the French Navy prevented the British fleet from supplying Cornwallis, then Washington would have him caught. He'd be cornered on the peninsula. So Washington moved his troops along 4 separate roads to confuse the British about their true intentions. British intelligence about the French fleet under the command of General Rochambeau was delayed, and thus the French fleet reached the Chesapeake Bay first. When the British fleet arrived in September 1781, the French fleet turned them back. Washington troops had arrived, and thus Cornwallis was indeed trapped. Washington's plan had worked. Washington had an army of approximately 15,000, while Cornwallis only had an army of 7,500. For 12 days, the Americans attacked and laid siege to the British at what became known as the Battle of Yorktown. Without resupply or of any hope of escape, Cornwallis soon fell short of food and supplies. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered. Actually, Cornwallis refused to attend and sent a subordinate to surrender farm. The defeated British marched through a double line of American and French troops to give up their weapons. The British band played the song "The World Turned Upside Down," kind of implying the colonies defeating the mother country. Washington did allow Cornwallis to take one ship and to go to Clinton in New York City. The rest of his troops were sent to prison camps in Virginia and Maryland. The surrender at Yorktown ended up being the end of the Revolutionary War. When news reached London, Prime Minister Lord North's ministry fell apart and Parliament voted to cease operations and to try to sue for peace. The guerrilla warfare, however, continued to wage in the back country of the Carolinas. At the time, keep in mind that the British still had troops in Savannah, Charleston, and New York City. And immature and emotional George III still wanted to pursue the war, but many British simply figured the war wasn't worth it. They could continue it, but it'd be costly, and the alternative was to trade with Americans and make money. So in that case, if they continued the war, their taxes would go up. So the citizenry was starting to turn against it. This concludes the 5th video on the fighting from 1781 to from 1778 to 1781.